When we're surrounded by all these options in our lives, how do we decide what really matters? I'm talking about the choices that we make. So I want to start off with this really sorry kind of joke. I don't know why I picked this one, but hey, it worked with choices. So here it goes. I'm not saying it's funny. So the college faculty were in their annual meeting when suddenly an angel appears. Turning to the dean, the creature said, "I will grant you one of these three boons: infinite wisdom, infinite wealth, or infinite health." The dean thought for a minute, then replied, "Wisdom." "So be it." And the angel disappeared. In the silence that followed, the dean sat thoughtfully, saying nothing and staring off into the distance. Finally, one of the faculty members exclaimed, "Do you have anything to say? What words of wisdom can you provide us?" And the dean said, "I should have taken the money." Oh, sorry. Fine. But the idea here is, choices. Life is filled with choices. And sometimes they're simple, sometimes they're serious, sometimes they're puny, sometimes they're profound. And some of the choices that we make don't have any lasting consequences whatsoever, like what you're going to have for lunch today or for dinner today. That doesn't really matter, unless, of course, it's poisonous and it's going to kill you, I guess. But other decisions, can have significant effects and impacts on your life, like what's your career going to be, or who you're going to spend the rest of your life with. And we're confronted with these choices every day. So, it's a myriad of choices. So I came up the parking lot, and there were all kinds of open spaces, and I had to decide which one am I going to choose. It's not a great consequence, but I had to make a choice. Am I going to buy the name brand cereal or the generic? Which am I going to choose? It's amazing. That there are these major life choices, of course. What college am I going to go to? What major am I going to have? What career am I going to follow? What person am I going to spend the rest of my life with? All those kinds of things. That these decisions are there before us. And the question is, how do we go about making those choices? What guides the process? Some people are kind of impulsive. And it's like, okay, they see something, like, oh, I like that, I'll do that. Others take time and they ponder and ponder and ponder. I'm kind of in the latter category, unfortunately. It can take me a long time to buy things, especially if it's anything of consequence, because I have to research it. I have to read all the reviews and figure out, okay, how people before me like this product. Is it going to last? Is there something that's going to frustrate me? And I have my father to blame for this. Whenever I was younger and I would want to buy something, he'd always ask me a myriad of questions, indicating that I haven't looked closely enough at this product. In fact, until just a few years ago, one of my Christmas presents from my father was a year's subscription to Consumer Reports. And I'm serious about that. So he would always give me that. And so that makes building a house a nightmare. I don't know if you recognize the stress of that, facing all of these choices. So a few months ago, we had to go into the plumbing store to just choose, tubs and toilets and faucets and so forth. And we're staring at this 3-wall room of faucets. And the lady said, "Which faucet do you want?" And I'm like, wait a minute. It's like, I haven't researched any of these. How do I decide not only what brand to choose, but of all the myriad models within a brand, which one I like? And it's just kind of like you say, oh, okay, that looks nice. Really? Everything within me says, no, that's not the way you make choices. Or even worse was the house that we're currently living in. We bought this about 10 years ago, I guess, or maybe a little bit more even. And it was a really tight market at that time. And so we were looking for a different house, and my wife calls me up and she says, I want you to meet me over at this house that I found. And so I go there and we do the walkthrough, and at the end of the walkthrough, the realtor says, "Are you ready to make an offer?" And everything within me screaming, no! I have to think about this. I have to ponder. I have to weigh the pros and cons. And she's like, well, if you don't make an offer, this house is going to be gone. I'm like, it was pure torture. And so, one of the most important decisions of our lives is whether to believe or not believe, to follow God or not follow God. Do we serve God or go on our own path? And the question is, how do we make that decision? And for some people, it's made by default, and they haven't really recognized the full significance of what it means to make that choice. And so this morning, we're going to look at the story of Joshua and the choice that he presents to the Israelites. And I think it's a pretty powerful kind of scene that we're going to talk about in Joshua 24. And this is after they've entered the Promised Land. But just to remind you, remember Joshua was an assistant of Moses from a very young age. It was Joshua who led the Israelites against the Amalekites in one of the very first battles that they fought after they left Egypt. Joshua is the one who accompanies Moses up to the mountain when God gives Moses the law. And after the tabernacle is built, it says that Moses would go and would come in before the presence of God, but Joshua would live there, or I should say stay there continuously. He was one of the 12 men that was sent in to spy the lands. You remember that he and Caleb had stood against the other 10 when they said, yes, we can take this land. And when Moses was not allowed to enter the Promised Land, it was Joshua who led them across the Jordan River into that land to take that which God had promised. And so here we have a story, after leading them in numerous successful battles, and they've conquered a good bit of this land, they gather at a place called Shechem. And Joshua comes to them, and he asks them to make one of the most important decisions they've ever made. He says, whom will you serve? And you might think, well, wait a minute, I thought this question had been settled long ago. You know, these are the Israelites after all. But that's not the case, because this group of people that he's talking to is a different group of people than those who have been brought out as slaves from Egypt. You remember those folks had been wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. They were the ones who had stood at Mount Sinai when God made a covenant. But not these folks. These are a different group. This is their children and their grandchildren. And so now Joshua is asking them to decide whom they will serve. So let's read this text, at least the beginning of this text, Joshua 24, 1 through 11. It's a rather lengthy reading, but we'll get the basic here. Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, the leaders, the judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abram, and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the river and led him throughout Canaan, and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I assigned the hill country of Seir to Esau, but to Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out. When I brought your fathers out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea. But they cried to the Lord for help, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and he brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians. Then you lived in the desert for a long time. I brought you to the land of the Amorites who live east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hands. I destroyed them from before you you took possession of their land. When Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, prepared to fight against Israel, he sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to put a curse on you. But I would not listen to Balaam, so he blessed you again and again, and I delivered you out of his hand. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I gave them into your hands." So here is Joshua rehearsing the history of what had happened to this people and to their fathers and to their grandfathers before them. And he starts this speech by reminding them of all of what God has already done for them. Now this is different, you might remember, from the call of Abram, because when Abram was called by God, he didn't know that God. He had to step out on faith. But these folks have seen the power of God at work. They've witnessed it firsthand. God has rescued them in battle. He's provided for them and protected them. And so now the choice is before them. Now, you might think, well, it's an obvious choice, is it not? Well, a couple of things to remember here, just as a side note. Remember, I think I've mentioned this before, that when we're reading Scripture, we're kind of reading the highlight reel, right? This is kind of like ESPN story of the game, where all you see are the touchdowns and the interceptions, and you don't see all the stuff in between. That there were years and years in between, or months and months in between spaces of God's activity where nothing seems to happen, where God perhaps seems absent. And even when God acts, sometimes He acts in such a way that they're not necessarily clear that it was God who gave them the victory, even though it was, right? So that it's not obvious what's going on here. And so this is a choice. Israel is asked to choose whom they will serve. But they live in a world filled with choices. Remember, there are all kinds of gods in this world. Yahweh is not the only one. Every nation they've encountered has a pantheon of gods. And so look at verse 14. Now fear the Lord and serve Him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Excuse me. Throughout the history of Israel, there's been this constant struggle with the worship of other gods. I mean, this, after all, was the way every other culture did it. Abraham and his family were idolaters. You might remember that scene in Jacob's story where his family was still carrying around idols. The Israelites were idolaters in Egypt, and they were idolaters in the wilderness. And now in the land of Canaan, they're still worshiping other gods in addition to this God. And so in a polytheistic religion, you have to understand the mindset. There was no exclusive claim. And so this was just the way it was. You could worship all kinds of gods. No God claimed exclusive rights. And each culture had their variety of gods. And they addressed not only the elements of nature, so you had gods of the sea and the god of agriculture and all that, but you had gods that would be over childbirth and gods over marriage and gods over death and all that kind of stuff. And so many of these religions, they might have a supreme deity, but he was usually very distant, and it didn't exclude these other gods. In fact, you might be partial to a particular god or goddess, but that didn't rule out you worshiping the others, or at least acknowledging them in some form or fashion. In fact, the more the merrier, right? The more gods you could get on your side, the better it was. And that was just the way the culture worked. And they also believed the gods to be fairly territorial. And we see evidence of this in Scripture. So if you're in Egypt, you worship the gods of Egypt because they're in control of that land. But once you go to the land of Canaan, then you got to start worshiping those gods so you don't make them unhappy. And who knows where this God this was in the wilderness with us is. You know, what's his territory? And so these people, as they're doing this, have a choice to make. And remember why people worship gods in the first place. So let's think about that. Well, first of all, the gods oftentimes help explain things. You know, you have all these myths about origins. They tell us where we came from. They give us some sense of how things came to be. But they also provide for us, right? They give us protection. They help us feel, in some sense, in control of our lives, in our world. Because nature can be very scary. And so if we offer things to the gods, make sacrifices to them, perhaps they'll choose to bless us. And they'll give us children, and they'll give us safety, and they'll give us crops. And so these supernatural powers are things that we appease and we appeal to. But Yahweh is asking for an exclusive relationship. He wants them to recognize that He is the God that they will worship. And that the other gods and worship of other gods would be unfaithfulness. In fact, if you go through the prophets, when the Israelites continue to backtrack and go after the idols of the people around them, the language that is used is like marital unfaithfulness. That it is as if they're going after other lovers. That they're committing adultery. Because this is meant to be an exclusive covenant. Let's look at verse 15. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, Then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether gods your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua is calling them to choose. We might think the choice would be easy, but Yahweh is competing against so many other successful deities. Think about the Egyptians. I mean, that culture that they came from was one of the most fascinating, marvelous civilizations at that time. Even us today, are marvel at what they were able to accomplish. And so viewed from the perspective of the ancient world, that would mean that their gods were pretty impressive as well. But who else knows this God that they're about to commit to? But this God has acted mightily for them, specifically, protecting them, showing them his care and concern. And now Joshua is calling them to make a conscious choice that will determine their destiny. Don't live in indecision, he says. Don't live in this divided loyalty. Make it clear in your heart whom you will serve. And each one must make that choice. Because in God's mind, in God's heart, there can be only one at the center. And in reality, that's still the choice that we face. Now, I doubt that most of you are tempted to serve Mot or Baal or Amun-Ra, although, we all have our secrets. But we're surrounded by a myriad of options and choices in our lives that compete for our loyalty. We've got jobs and family and hobbies and church and school and community activities, all that kind of stuff that seek a place that God is supposed to have in our lives. And so we have to recognize that. We have to recognize that they can sometimes give us control over our lives and give us purpose and identity, which is what God is supposed to give. And so take, as a simple and obvious example, our careers, right? That they often take center stage in our life because they're so much a part of who we are. They give us identity. They take up so much of our time. Success in our career can give us a sense of accomplishment. And we are oftentimes, identified by what we do. That's one of the first questions we ask. Well, what do you do? Because that's who you are. At least we think that way. Time and energy is poured into a career as one of the foundational priorities of our lives. And I don't mean to imply that our jobs should be or can be unimportant. They obviously have to take up a good bit of our time. But the question still remains, and what I want us to focus on is, what sits at the center of our lives? What is it that's driving us? What guides your choices? What functions as that determining factor in the decisions you make? Every day we make decisions about how we are going to spend our time, how we're going to spend our resources, our energy. But what criteria are we using to make those choices? What sets your life's priorities? Whatever these priorities are, that's what's going to steer the ship. That's where you're going to go. And so the interesting part about that is that for most people, they live an unexamined life. And the choices that they make are kind of already set for them by culture. Indeed, life is a slippery thing. We can live our entire lives without truly figuring out who we're serving. And we just do what's expected next. And so when you think back about your own upbringing and how you got to the place you are today, I reflect, I remember as a kid, it was kind of like there were always these milestones that you were reaching for. You want to be a teenager, and then you want to be able to drive. And then you want to be able to get out of high school and graduate. And it was kind of like, these were the things that you looked forward to that guided your life. And all of them were just kind of the cultural goals and priorities that were given to me. I hadn't decided on that. It was kind of like, that's the expected thing. They were given to me. But, as you go along, you get out of college. I guess one of the first major choices that I had to make was, what are you going to do for a living? And so that's a major decision. But then you get out of college and you're kind of in your first job and you're having to learn what that's all about. And then perhaps kids come along and that takes a lot of time. And before you know it, you get so busy that it's just not a whole lot of time for reflection, for figuring out what's the big picture, what's the ultimate goal in life. And you're just trying to survive. I don't know, maybe some of you are there right now. You just, the demands of work and school are so much that you just try and get through the day to the next day. And your professors have set for you the priorities for this semester, so you're, okay, I got to do that. And we just go through life like that. And the priorities are just set almost by default. Then one day you wake up and life's half over and you're wondering, okay, did I spend my time doing the right kinds of things? Is this really where I want to be? And where do I want to go from here? And so I thought about this movie, and I recognize that, I'm getting so old now that perhaps you've never seen this. How many of you have ever seen this movie? City Slickers, anybody? See? Okay, I got one, maybe? Maybe. If you haven't seen it, it's kind of a cool movie to see. It's back from the 1990s, so when I looked up the date, I thought, wow, that's so old that some of these people weren't even alive, maybe. I don't know. What's that?
I was born then.
Were you potty trained yet?
Yeah.
Okay, so you were potty trained. But this is Billy Crystal. I don't know if you know who Billy Crystal is. You know who Billy Crystal is, right? But this is an interesting movie. It's a comedy, of course, because it's got Billy Crystal in it. But it's about a guy, I think he's 39-year-old baby boomer. And he's having it, his birthday's coming up, and he's having this midlife crisis. He's kind of wondering, what have I done with my life? Am I where I want to be? And so he and his buddies go out on this cattle drive. It's kind of a midlife kind of crisis birthday present thing. And he's wondering, does life truly have meaning? He's searching for meaning in this life. And so Jack Palance, who's now dead, you might not know who that is, but he's an old crusty cowboy leading the cattle drive. And they have this discussion back and forth. He doesn't speak a whole lot, spits and grunts and commands some things, but other than that, doesn't talk a whole lot. But there's this one conversation that they have on the cattle drive, and Jack Palance's character, Curly, is trying to straighten out Billy Crystal's character. And he's like, okay, he says, you want to know what the secret to life is? And Billy Crystal, of course, is like, yeah, tell me the secret to life. And that's the scene. He says, it's this. And he holds up his finger. And Billy Crystal's like, mystified. Okay, what's that? And he says, one thing. And Billy Crystal says, well, what's the one thing? And Curly says back, well, that's what you have to figure out. The one thing. And that's perhaps, a great deal of truth in that. The secret is figuring out what the one thing is that guides and directs and orients our whole life. And if that one thing isn't meaningful, it all falls apart. You got to know what the one thing is. And oftentimes we get distracted by too many things pulling at us. We've got a myriad of priorities. And we follow this one for a time and that one for a time. But we can also maybe make the wrong choice in the one thing. And that distracts us as well. Now, you might be wondering, after all of this, why am I talking about making choices for God when I'm talking to a bunch of Christians who perhaps have made choices a long time ago for God? What relevance does that have for us? Well, I think there's 2 points I want to bring home for us. One is this idea of cultural Christianity I brought up before, that sometimes that choice that we made for God was perhaps not a choice for God. It was just a choice to follow the path that everybody had chosen for us. It was the path of, being a part of church culture, being a part of cultural Christianity. It's like graduating from high school. You just do it. You go to church and you say, I'm a Christian because everybody else is saying that. Especially in the South. I run into this all the time, where there's so much pressure to families who are raised here for their kids to fall in line. So they do. And so you have this thin chocolate veneer of religion over the larger secular nougaty center, right? And so our Christian becomes, we become Christians to please our family, to fit in with our friends, to look like we're not strange in this larger culture. Now, in this church, we have, I'm sure, a variety of stories, and I don't know what caused you originally to make a decision for Jesus, and I'd actually like to hear some of those stories. But the challenge that we face is to keep him at the center, to recognize that you don't fool yourself into thinking, well, I go to church, I do Christian things, and that because of that, that you really have him at the center, because that can become simply a token nod. That could be, oh, I've put in my time, I please God, now I can go off and do my own thing. So I want us to kind of recognize where our priorities are. And I think the second reason why this whole topic is important is to realize that the choice we make isn't a one-time only choice. It's a continual process of reaffirming that choice. That oftentimes in our lives it's so easy to get off track that occasionally we need to do a driver check to see who's actually behind the wheel. Who's running the ship? To ask us who's in control. And whether you like it or not, your life's priorities will be reflected in whatever you spend your time and resources doing. And so think about your average day and what you do, and that will begin to give you an answer. I had a friend who loves to say, people will make time for what's important to them. And so I was often reminded of my daughter, because that's one of her favorite. Like, Dad, I don't have time for that. And I'll ask her to say, you need to go get the oil change. And you go, I don't have time for that. So, well, you need to go register, you have your car registration. I don't have time for that. But she has time. I mean, she spends hours and hours and hours practicing for, they call it Spring Fling at Lipscomb. It's this kind of spring review where they learn dance routines and songs and all that stuff. And she'll spend hours practicing for that. Well, that's why you don't have time for this other stuff that's kind of important. Because it wasn't important to her, but this other was. The stuff that's important for us, that's what we make time for. That's why we don't have time for the other stuff. Because we're doing the stuff that's important to us. And that's what shows you where your center really is. So as we think through that and we reflect on that, we have to recognize and decide what's really driving the car. Who's driving the car? And think about it. Most of us perhaps have never spent time thinking about why we do what we do. We just get up. You go to work, you come home, and you just go through the motions. But being a spiritual giant is about being intentional. It's about reflecting on the priorities in your life and deciding on whom you will serve. And if not God, then what? And once you name what you are truly serving, I want you to ask yourself, is it worthy of that honor? Because if it's not, you need to get it out of the center of your life. I'll invite the praise team to come back up and close with this kind of question for you, I guess. When you decide on what that one thing is that Curly's talking about, I would suggest to you that if it's not God, that in the end, you'll ultimately be disappointed because it won't be able to provide what you think it will. Let's praise God together.